Cool. So I've been playing around with contract testing for a long time, and I wanted to integrate it with my end-to-end tests. So I started exploring what options I had, and so I wanted to share those learnings with you. We're going to sort out the muting situation, right?
This is Prashant. Whoever has the admin rights, they might want to mute him.
Thank you. Cool. So my name is Lewis Prescott. I am a QA lead at Seracare. So Seracare is a startup in the healthcare space. We work with carers and people going into people's homes to offer care. We are a startup based out of the UK, and we're looking to expand into Europe at the moment. But yeah, it's a really cool space to be in. Really enjoy working there. Before, I used to work for ASOS and Cancer Research UK, if you know those brands. Also, in my kind of side hustle time, I have a course on Test Automation University on API testing with JavaScript. It's a great platform if you haven't already checked it out. I run workshops with Ministry of Testing. I have a podcast if you fancy taking a listen. Once you've listened to this talk, if you fancy getting started with contract testing, check out my podcast. And also appeared on Tester Island Discs podcast chatting about contract testing as well, which might be a useful resource after this. So that's a bit about me. Hopefully that gives you a bit of insight into what I'm talking about today. There's kind of three parts to it. So I'm going to talk to you about what is an API contract and how we use that with the tools, the benefits of using stubs in your end-to-end tests, and then I'm going to show you a demo of how you would implement that using Cypress. So to give a bit of context on this, microservices is kind of the core basis of this, right? This is the reason why I got started with contract testing in the first place. And so when I was doing my research for this talk, I came across this article which described how microservices has increased over time. And it paints a nice picture of how you can see the need for this type of testing, because microservices is just increasing over time. So what does that actually mean? So before, when we had monolith applications,
I have some lecture.
Before you had traditional API testing, which would test multiple services, you would have an entry point, right? You would have an entry point which would go in and then you get a response back. Whereas when we moved to microservices, we now have those isolated services which we can test in isolation. And that's where we can pinpoint the contracts. So what do we mean by a contract? Talking about like OpenAPI, Swagger documentation, which generates those contracts for us, or those defined contracts that you define before you start your development. So once we have those contracts, then we can start implementing contract testing. And in a microservice architecture, we can then isolate those areas of tests. So Martin Fowler explains it much better than I can, but to describe what an end-to-end test we're talking about. So when we're talking about a microservices architecture, within that, we need to test the end-to-end journey. And so an end-to-end test covers all of those from an external requirements perspective. And that's where we want to test that entire system. So when you're testing that entire flow, are you testing mocked, where you're stubbing out or mocking out any of those external dependencies? So when we're talking about that end-to-end journey with the microservice architecture behind it, are you mocking out those dependencies that you don't have control over, those dependencies which you don't necessarily need inside your tests, but you need them to run your end-to-end suite? Or are you running your tests inside an integrated environment? Integrated environment, I mean, you're not stubbing anything out, you're not mocking anything out, you're running your end-to-end tests on an environment so you can see the full end-to-end flow and you can see the real life scenario for your users. There's benefits, pros and cons to both, right? So mocking doesn't reflect the production environment. Integrated tests can be difficult to maintain and costly to run, but they do have their pros as well. There's not necessarily one is better than the other. So I want to find out which method you guys are using. So if you can go to menti.com and then type in the code to get to the question. Just going to navigate away from the screen, but you'll get the code back in a minute. How do you get rid of this thing? Cool. So if you haven't got the code yet, it's menti.com and use the code at the top of the screen. Yeah, it's already starting to show up. Lots of people use a hybrid approach, which I think is quite common. And it makes sense, right? Because when you've got lots of dependencies, there's some things which may make your test flaky, or some things which are completely out of your control, like third-party dependencies and stuff, which you may want to mock out. But again, that doesn't reflect the true representation. And also it may be another service which another team owns, which you could have a bit more control over. Cool. No one says other, so that's good. I just chucked in the other option just as a catch-all, but cool. So I think this hopefully highlights the reason why I've come up with this alternative using the Pactflow tool, which supports generating your contracts and generating a stub at the end of it. So let me go back. So let me just explain what contract testing is, if hopefully, so everyone's on the same page. So the way that I describe contract testing is it's flipping integration testing upside down. So when you think about your traditional API tests, you're sending a request, which is usually the API team sending a request, and they're asserting the response. They're asserting the headers, they're asserting all the stuff around it, right? The response codes, all that stuff. The way that contract testing originally dictated that you did it, there's another new concept, which I'll explain a bit later. But the traditional approach is consumer driven. So the consumer, and when I talk about the consumer, I'm talking about a web app, another service that integrates with that API, a mobile app, all those things are consumers in this scenario. They generate the scenarios. So if you think about it, they generate the test scenarios, and then they pass those over to the API team, and then the API team just replay those requests. The API team isn't writing the test scenarios. So that's why I say it's about flipping it upside down. And I've worked in quite a lot of environments before, and it's a them versus us kind of scenario, where the backend holds the data and holds the contracts of how you gain access to that data. And then the front end is the person that just renders it and requests it. And they don't really have much control over that side of things. I'm not saying that's every context, but there's also a a natural phenomenon that would occur, right? You're writing code in different languages, you're interested in different things, you're part of two different clubs, front end club and the back end club. You potentially have different machines. Someone's writing .NET on a Windows machine, the front end developers writing on a Mac. So you're very part of two different contexts, and that's why it's them versus us. And we have full stack developers. We have teams that are very mature and work very well together. I'm not saying that it's not, this is always the case, just demonstrating how things can veer away from each other when you are working in this architecture. The reason why you would do integration testing is for this purpose, right? Once you've gone away, you've built both your sides of things, and then you come back together and then you realize there's an integration problem. So that's what these contract tests are there to solve. And again, Martin Fowler describes it much better than I can. It's testing at that external boundary. So you're not actually testing the integration together. You're testing the external boundaries, and then the contract test test the two relationships together. But there's no communication between the two. And diagrams very helpful for this context. So this is from the Pactflow website of how Pact works, and recommend checking out the documentation if you want to learn more. So what happens is the consumer sends their request to a mock. The mock then replays that and says, okay, this is the contract. And then that gets passed to the provider. Provider just pulls down the contract from Pactflow, the store of the contracts, and then the provider replays those on their side against their local running instance of the API. The reason why you would do this is so you can run tests independently, get fast feedback before you've got your integration environment, for example. They're stable because they're using mocks and they're using their own contexts, and they're easy to maintain because they sit right next to the code base. And the main aim of these is to give you confidence to release within a microservices architecture, for example. The confidence is the main thing, right? Because before when we had our monoliths, we had our end-to-end test, which tested the whole thing, and we were confident. But now we need to make sure that all the pieces fit together in the puzzle. So where does Pactflow come into this? So I've mentioned it a few times. Pactflow is the storer of the contracts. And you've got Paxton, who's their new mascot. I really love, I should have worn my t-shirt today. So you generate the contract and then you publish that to Pactflow. Pactflow stores the contracts, stores the version of the contract, stores the tag, so you can say whether it's on production, whether it's on an environment, all that stuff. And then the provider pulls down the contract and they verify it. Once that loop has been closed, then the consumer side says, have you verified my contract of my new changes? Yes, okay, I'm going to release to production. The other benefit of this is that the provider can now see all of their consumers in one place and how they're communicating with that API. So let's break it down into very simple steps. So you define your contract, you develop the web part of the feature. You can also develop the API side by side if you wanted to. Write the consumer tests, store those in Pactflow in the broker, develop the API side, pull the contracts from the Pact broker and run the consumer tests. All good, simple steps. It's quite hard to grasp just in describing, but yeah, check out the Pactflow documentation for more help on that. The biggest benefit that I see from this type of testing is the communication that you gain. I've worked in environments where you have many distributed teams working on many different things, right? It's very hard to find time to communicate in those contexts. And also it's very complex, right? You're talking to a team that has knowledge which is completely different to your own. But this type of testing allows you to be on the same page and also relay what you are doing, the behaviors, the interactions that you're doing, and develop those conversations quickly, easily, and early. So before, we were communicating via the specs, the API specs, through Swagger, through a Word document, through a Confluence wiki page. We're communicating through that. If there's any changes, you update the sheet, you communicate with the team and say, I've updated the API contract, please go in and change it from your side. Whereas now we've got documented information about those consumers and how they're interacting with each other. Also helps you have those conversations, right? Say the API is missing a field that you need. You can easily add that into the contract, and now you've got a new version. So it's very easy to maintain that way. Cool. So other benefits. So I think the main benefit is the communication that it builds between microservices, but there's other benefits as well. So you can test earlier. You don't need a dedicated environment. You gain much more confidence when you're deploying in a fast-moving environment because you've got the security of your contracts. The visibility, you can easily visualize the consumer behavior and also how they're using it. They might not even be using all the fields that you've put into this API. And it's isolated. So you can test those individual microservices in isolation and the front-end application in isolation. Add into that, you can now use the stub that you have generated as part of your contract to add to your end-to-end tests. So now your end-to-end tests are even isolated. And that's what I'm going to describe. So we've implemented our contract tests. I can't go into all of that today, but check out the resources online or check out some of my videos on my website. Isolated end-to-end tests. Generate the API contract. Once you've got the contract, you publish it to Pactflow. In Pactflow, you can just add the stub, add append the URL of the contract, make it a stub, and you can use that inside your end-to-end tests. For this example, I'm going to be using Cypress. I'm speaking at the Cypress Meetup, so that falls in line. And then you just run your end-to-end test, which pulls down the contract as part of the test, and all's good. So it's demo time. I'm sure there's lots of questions. I'll come on to questions later, maybe. Cool. Yeah, I'll come on to questions later. Yeah, you can see my whole screen. Fine. The Zoom window always gets in the way. I don't know where to put it, so it's not in the way. Cool. So we have our Cypress project. This is a React app. It's a very simple React app. I can show you. It just is a recipe app. So this one just renders a chocolate cake. There's nothing more complicated than that. And then the show ingredients calls an API to return the ingredients that you would need to make the cake. So that's the React app. It's very simple. It's based on Bake Off reference. If you know the Great British Bake Off, Paul Hollywood wants the apps to be created in this hypothetical scenario. So yeah, that's all we've got. We've got Cypress, we've got React. Sorted. We got some other stuff, but we're not using any of that. Cool. So this is the gist of it. So in Cypress, we can do these tasks before the test run, and that's where the stub comes in. So in order to get the ingredients that I need to run my end-to-end tests, I call this task. So within the task, this points to the Pactflow instance that I have set up. And I'm a fan of the show. I'm a fan of Great British Bake Off. So I want to call this API to get the ingredients that I saw on the show. And I'm going to pass the stub URL as part of the test. And this will then return me the response data. So the stub from Pactflow. So Pactflow looks like this, which is this API. So it has these interactions, and these interactions are what the stub is going to return. So within Pact, you set up these interactions and you say what the response is. You add these matching rules because obviously within a test, you don't want to hard code things like values. Like if you had a GUID, for example, you're not going to hard code GUID. So you tell it what type to expect. But ultimately, this is what the stub is going to return for us. So within our test, I know this is a valid response because the provider has verified this, and this is a genuine, this is how you would set up a mock anyway. So why not swap it out for a real thing? So once the response is returned, I'm going to then return that to the task. So within the test, when I call the task, I'm going to use that data that it's returned, and I'm going to add that as my response within the intercept command. So this is the local instance of the API. It's not running. I don't need to run it as part of my end-to-end suite anymore because I'm going to reply with the data that comes back from my mock. So this is the cake, and the URL of the cake is chocolate cake. And this is interacting with my website. So let's run the test. So just run it again. So you can see the task was run, called the get ingredients, and then it set up this stub. And as part of this, I can then use it because when I hit show ingredients now, it's going to return that response that I just showed you in Pactflow. And my test now passes because I've got that stub. Cool. So that's pretty much it. There's another option that you can use in this scenario. So if you have a React app and you have Cypress tests, what you can do is you can just set up the app URL. So usually within your React app, you will have a environment variable, which is set up to point to your API. So I'll compare them for you. So in this one, when I launch my React app, it points to my local environment. And then if I deploy this to integration environment, that will point to the integration environment. What you could do is you could point that to your stub so that you have set up in Pactflow. So instead of having that task that sets up calls the stub and then returns the data, what you could do is just when you launch your application, that's when you can insert the stub. And at that point, you would just need to run the tests, right? You wouldn't need to set up any of this. So ultimately, there's two options. Cool. Let's jump back. Oh, I skipped a thing, right? Did you answer any questions on the next one? Other end-to-end issues. I should have come up with this earlier, but it still lives true right at this point, because the reason why I came up with a solution is because my tests were flaky. It's because I didn't have confidence because they were mocked. It's because there's non-testable third parties. Third party is a really difficult one, and probably one not for this session. Long execution. It's much faster for me to call a stub that responds immediately. Yeah, cool. Hopefully I've answered some of your issues. Sweet. So there's another option to using Cypress and Pactflow. So I talked about earlier about the traditional method of using consumer-driven contracts. Bidirectional offers you the ability to generate your contracts after everything's been developed. So the idea of bidirectional, again, there's videos on Pactflow's website. Not going to go into the detail, but you add in an adapter. So they've created a Cypress adapter for generating the contracts. So now you can generate the contracts as part of your tests. So again, it's similar, it intercepts the request and tells it, okay, this is how you are communicating with the API, generates a contract. Once you've got that contract, that can be your stub, right? So you don't need to call out to Pactflow. You've now generated that stub within your test. So next time you run your test, you've got that stub, which you can point to. Adapters is for another time, but just to point you in that direction, it's available. And if you've already got lots of Cypress tests and you don't have contracts, this is the easy way to get on board with that. Cool. So Pactflow's mantra is safe to deploy on Fridays. And I believe with implementing this scenario, you can deploy on Fridays and have no worries. Hopefully there's some questions. I'll take a look in the chat. But yeah, if you want to follow me or you want to ask some questions after this, follow me on Twitter. My name's Lewis Prescott on there, and LinkedIn, follow me on there. I have a podcast about contract testing at pacman.co.uk. So check that out and take a listen. Thank you. I'm going to answer some questions now.